My father kicked me out of his own wedding because the bride said she didn't want losers at the party. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment my life became someone else's story. I was 35 years old, sitting in my living room on a Tuesday evening after work, feeling pretty damn good about where I'd landed in life. I'd just finished paying off a major chunk of my mortgage on this 3-bedroom ranch-style house that I'd bought 2 years earlier. Every payment felt like victory, because I'd done it alone, without help, working my way up as a civil engineer in a male-dominated field that loved to remind me I didn't belong there. The house wasn't huge or fancy, but it was mine. The kitchen had granite countertops I'd picked out myself. The master bedroom had this amazing walk-in closet I'd customized. The backyard had a little garden where I'd planted tomatoes and herbs that actually grew, despite my complete lack of gardening knowledge. I'd hung every picture on every wall, chosen every piece of furniture, painted every room the exact colors I wanted. For the first time in my adult life, I felt settled, complete, like I'd built something real and permanent. Then my phone rang, and my father's name appeared on the screen, and I made the mistake of answering. His voice sounded hollow, defeated in a way I'd never heard before. The divorce was final, he told me. His second wife had cleaned out their joint bank account and moved to another state with her new boyfriend, someone she'd apparently been seeing for the last 8 months of their marriage. My father had been living on a friend's couch for 3 weeks, and that friend's wife was starting to complain about the arrangement. He didn't ask directly, not at first. He just talked in circles about how humiliating it was to be 55 years old and essentially homeless, how he'd worked his whole life and had nothing to show for it, how he didn't know what he was going to do. The implication hung in the air between us like smoke. I could have pretended not to understand. I could have offered him money for a security deposit on an apartment. I could have helped him look for rooms to rent. Instead, I heard myself saying he could stay with me temporarily just until he got back on his feet. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he started crying, actually sobbing, thanking me over and over, calling me his angel, his saving grace, saying he didn't deserve a daughter as good as me. I felt my chest tighten with that familiar mix of emotions my father always triggered: love, resentment, obligation, frustration. We'd never been particularly close, especially after my mother left when I was 12, but he was still my father. Family helps family, right? That's what I told myself. He moved in on a Saturday morning in late March. I'd spent the previous week preparing, moving all my personal items out of the master bedroom into the smaller guest room, making space in the closet and bathroom for his things. I told myself it was temporary, maybe 2 or 3 months maximum while he found a job and saved for his own place. When his friend's truck pulled into my driveway, I was shocked by how little he had. 4 boxes, 2 suitcases, a garbage bag full of clothes, and a lamp. That was it. 55 years of life reduced to what could fit in the bed of a pickup truck. We carried everything inside in one trip, and I showed him around like he was a guest, pointing out where I kept extra towels, how the shower temperature was tricky, which cabinet had the coffee mugs. He kept saying thank you, kept touching things gently like he was afraid he'd break something, kept looking at me with this grateful expression that made me uncomfortable. That night, we ordered Chinese food and ate at my kitchen table, the same table where I usually ate alone while scrolling through my phone. He told me stories about my childhood that I barely remembered, made jokes that weren't particularly funny, but I laughed anyway, carefully avoided mentioning his ex-wife or the divorce or anything that might darken the mood. When we said goodnight and went to our separate rooms, I lay in the smaller bed in the guest room and stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd just made a huge mistake or done something genuinely kind. I decided it was probably both. The first month was actually okay. Better than okay, honestly. My father made an effort to be the perfect house guest. He'd be up before me every morning, have coffee already brewed when I stumbled into the kitchen at 6:30. He'd do the dishes without being asked, vacuum the living room, take out the trash, water my garden. He applied for jobs constantly, printing out resumes on my printer and disappearing for interviews 2 or 3 times a week. In the evenings, we'd have dinner together and watch television shows we both liked, this comfortable routine that felt almost normal. I started to think maybe this could work, that maybe we could build an actual relationship now that I was an adult, and he wasn't trying to parent me anymore. He told me about his job search frustrations, and I'd offer advice or connections when I could. I told him about my projects at work, the difficult clients and impossible deadlines, and he'd listen in a way he never had when I was younger. One night, about 5 weeks in, he looked at me across the dinner table and said he was proud of me, proud of what I'd built, proud of the woman I'd become. I actually teared up because I'd waited my whole life to hear him say that. Looking back now, I wish I could reach through time and shake that naive version of myself, tell her to enjoy these peaceful weeks because they were about to end in spectacular fashion. Month 3 arrived with spring turning to early summer, and my father met her. I remember the exact evening because I'd had a particularly brutal day at work, dealing with a contractor who'd completely botched a foundation pour, and I came home exhausted and irritable. My father was sitting on the couch with this dopey smile on his face, practically vibrating with excitement. He told me he'd met someone at the grocery store that morning, a woman who'd reached for the same box of cereal he'd grabbed, and they'd laughed about it and started talking right there in the breakfast aisle. They'd talked for so long that other shoppers had to reach around them. They'd moved their conversation to the parking lot and talked for another hour and a half sitting on the tailgate of someone's truck. Her name was... Actually, you know what? Her name doesn't matter. What matters is that my father was absolutely smitten in a way I'd never seen. He showed me her number saved in his phone like it was a winning lottery ticket. He told me she was 42, worked in retail until recently, had the most beautiful laugh, loved the same classic rock bands he did, and made him feel like he was 25 again. I was happy for him, genuinely. He'd been so depressed after his divorce, and seeing him excited about something was nice. They went on their first date that Saturday, and he came home at 11 at night glowing, talking nonstop about the restaurant they'd gone to, the conversation they'd had, how easy and natural everything felt with her. He told me he thought this could be something real, something special. I hugged him and told him I was glad he'd found someone who made him happy. I meant it. At that point, I actually meant it. Their relationship moved fast. Within 2 weeks, they were seeing each other almost every day. My father was rarely home, which was fine by me because it meant I had my house to myself again. When he was home, he'd be on the phone with her for hours, laughing at things that weren't that funny, talking in that soft voice people use when they're falling for someone. I'd hear him through the walls late at night, saying goodnight like they were teenagers. It was a little embarrassing, but also kind of sweet. Then week 6 hit, and everything changed. I came home from work on a Wednesday afternoon to find my father standing in the living room with her, and she had 3 large suitcases lined up by the door. Not overnight bags, not a backpack for a sleepover. 3 massive suitcases, the kind you take on international trips. My father had this sheepish expression on his face, and she had this smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Before I could even ask what was happening, he launched into this explanation about how she'd had a terrible fight with her roommate, how she'd been kicked out with nowhere to go, how she just needed a place to stay for a couple weeks until she found a new apartment. He asked if it would be okay if she crashed in his room temporarily. What was I supposed to say? No? In front of her? After she was standing right there looking at me like she was waiting for me to be the villain? I felt ambushed, trapped, but I said fine, a couple weeks, and watched relief flood my father's face. She thanked me in this overly sweet voice that immediately set my teeth on edge, calling me a lifesaver and saying she'd stay out of my way completely. That should have been my first warning sign. People who promise to stay out of your way never do. Within 48 hours, she'd completely taken over. Her clothes didn't just share the closet with my father's things, they'd consumed the entire space, pushing his stuff into one corner. Her shoes appeared in every room, heels by the front door, flip-flops in the bathroom, sneakers in the kitchen. Her toiletries spread across the bathroom counter like an invading army. 17 different bottles of hair products, 9 makeup palettes, 4 hair straighteners and curling irons, an entire collection of nail polish that took up the drawer I'd been using for first aid supplies. I found her shampoo in my shower, her toothbrush next to mine, her face masks in my medicine cabinet. She rearranged my living room furniture because the couch looked better facing the other direction. She reorganized my kitchen cabinets because I had things in illogical places. She changed the channel whenever she walked into a room, even if I was already watching something. She took my favorite coffee mug and claimed it as her own, getting annoyed when I tried to use it. And through all of this, my father just smiled and acted like everything was normal and wonderful. When I tried to talk to him alone one evening, asking quietly when exactly she was planning to start apartment hunting, he got defensive immediately. He said she was going through a hard time, that she'd had a difficult life, that I should be more compassionate. He said she made him happier than he'd been in years, and couldn't I just be supportive for once in my life? That last part hit me like a slap. For once? I'd literally given him my house, my bedroom, my peace of mind. But apparently that wasn't enough. I was supposed to sacrifice even more, endlessly without complaint. I felt something harden inside my chest that night, but I pushed it down. I told myself it was still just temporary, that she'd be gone soon, that I could tolerate anything for a few more weeks. Spoiler alert, she didn't work. I realized this slowly, like watching a photograph develop in a dark room. The first morning after she moved in, I left for work at 7, assuming she'd have somewhere to be to. When I came home at 6 that evening, she was on my couch in the exact same position, wearing the same pajamas, watching the same type of reality show. I figured she'd had the day off, but then it happened the next day, and the day after that. By day 5, I straight up asked her what her work schedule was like. She gave this vague answer about how she was between opportunities right now and taking some time to focus on herself and her relationship with my father. Translation: she had no job, no prospects, and no intention of getting either while she had free room and board. Every single day I'd leave for work and she'd be sprawled on my couch. Every single evening I'd come home and she'd still be there, surrounded by snack wrappers and dirty dishes and soda cans. The television would be blaring something mindless. She'd barely acknowledge my presence, maybe a half-hearted wave without taking her eyes off the screen. My father would get home from whatever job search activities he was doing, and immediately it was like she transformed. Suddenly, she was energetic and affectionate, greeting him at the door, asking about his day, being the perfect girlfriend. He'd dote on her constantly, asking if she needed anything, if she was comfortable, if he could get her some water or a snack. She'd stretch out on the couch like a cat and make these little requests, and he'd jump to fulfill them like he was her personal servant. It made me want to scream. The disrespect started small, then grew like mold creeping up a wall. First, it was little comments. She'd look at my outfits for work and say things like, "That's an interesting choice," with this tone that made it clear she thought I looked terrible. She'd ask if I'd considered updating my wardrobe because my style seemed very dated and conservative. She'd comment on what I ate, suggesting I should watch my portions if I wanted to stay healthy. She'd observe that I seemed to work a lot. Wasn't it sad that I didn't have anyone to come home to? Didn't I want a family someday before it was too late? Every comment felt like a small cut, designed to make me feel inadequate in my own home. I tried to ignore her, told myself she was insecure and taking it out on me. Then she escalated to using my things. I started noticing my expensive skincare products were being used, the bottles getting emptier faster than they should. My nice perfume that I saved for special occasions was definitely at a different level than I'd left it. One day, I found her wearing my cashmere sweater, the really nice one I'd bought myself as a birthday present, and when I pointed out that it was mine, she laughed and said borrowing clothes was just what women did, that I should stop being so possessive. The sweater came back stretched out and reeking of her perfume, basically unwearable. When I complained to my father, he told me I was making a big deal out of nothing, that it was just a sweater, that I could afford to replace it if I was that upset. Not she should replace it. Not she shouldn't have taken it. I could afford to replace it. Like my financial situation gave everyone permission to use and abuse my belongings. Then came the wine. I'd been building a modest wine collection. Nothing crazy expensive, but nice bottles I'd picked up from local vineyards on weekend trips. I was saving them for special occasions, or at least planning to savor them properly. I came home one Thursday evening to find one of my favorite bottles empty on the counter, and her sprawled on the couch drunk at 5 in the afternoon, giggling at a reality show about housewives. I stood there holding the empty bottle, and she looked at me and said, "Oh yeah, I found that in your cabinet, hope you don't mind, it was pretty good." Hope you don't mind, like it was an afterthought. A casual courtesy instead of asking before taking something that wasn't hers. I minded very much. I said as much, trying to keep my voice calm but firm, and she rolled her eyes at me. Actually rolled her eyes like I was the one being unreasonable. She said I needed to learn how to share, that hoarding things for someday was stupid because someday might never come, that I should be grateful someone was actually enjoying my stuff instead of letting it collect dust. My father walked in during this exchange and immediately took her side. He said I was being uptight and possessive, exactly like I'd been as a child with my toys, never wanting to share with other kids. He said he'd raised me better than this. I walked away before I said something I couldn't take back, went to my small bedroom, and cried angry tears of frustration. This was my house, my things, my space, and somehow, I was being made to feel like the villain for wanting to maintain basic boundaries. The car incident happened on a Saturday morning in late June, and it was the moment I realized this situation was completely out of control. I woke up around 9, planning to run some errands and maybe hit the farmer's market. I pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed my keys from the hook by the front door, and walked outside to find my driveway empty. Just bare concrete where my car should have been. My first thought was that it had been stolen, and I felt panic rise in my throat as I pulled out my phone to call the police. Then I decided to check with my father first in case he'd moved it for some reason. I found him in the kitchen making breakfast, and when I asked if he knew where my car was, he barely looked up from the stove. He said his girlfriend had taken it to run some errands, said it casually like this was completely normal and expected. She'd taken my car, without asking, without even telling me, just walked into my house, grabbed my keys like they were hers, and drove away in my vehicle. I felt rage bubble up so hot and sudden that I had to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. I asked my father if he understood that this was not okay, that you can't just take someone's car without permission. He flipped a pancake and said she'd needed to pick up some things and didn't have a car of her own, so what was she supposed to do? I said she was supposed to ask, or take the bus, or walk, or literally anything other than stealing my property. He sighed like I was being difficult and said I was overreacting, that she'd bring it back in a few hours. 5 hours. That's how long she kept my car. When she finally returned at 3 in the afternoon, I was waiting in the driveway. She pulled in blasting music, climbed out leaving the driver's door wide open, and tossed me my keys like she was doing me a favor by returning them. The gas tank was completely empty, like she'd driven until the warning light came on and then decided that was close enough to my house. There was a fresh dent in the rear bumper. The back seat was covered in fast food trash. Burger wrappers, fry containers, soda cups with melted ice. The car smelled like grease and her perfume. I demanded to know what the hell she thought she was doing. She looked at me like I'd asked her to explain quantum physics, this expression of complete confusion about why I was upset. She said she'd needed to run errands, and I was always at work anyway. So why did it matter if she borrowed my car on a weekend? Borrowed. Like she'd asked and I'd agreed. I pointed at the dent, the empty tank, the trash everywhere. She shrugged and said the dent was already there. It wasn't. She'd fill up the tank next time. There wouldn't be a next time. And she'd clean out the trash later. She wouldn't. Before I could respond, my father appeared and physically stepped between us, putting his hand on my shoulder in this patronizing way that made me want to scream. He asked if we could talk inside, privately, his tone suggesting I was the one causing problems. In my own kitchen, he proceeded to lecture me about compassion and understanding. He said she was going through a tough time, adjusting to being in a new place, dealing with the trauma of her previous living situation. He said she didn't have a car because she'd fallen on hard times financially, and wasn't it the Christian thing to help those less fortunate than ourselves? I pointed out that I was already helping by giving them free housing, utilities, food, and apparently now my vehicle. He said I was starting to sound selfish and bitter, that the daughter he'd raised was compassionate and generous, and he didn't recognize this angry person standing in front of him. That hurt worse than anything she could have done. He was rewriting history, making me the villain, choosing her over me in ways that felt deliberate and cruel. I told him she needed to ask before using my things, that this was non-negotiable. He said fine. He'd talk to her, but I needed to be more flexible and understanding. She never apologized. She never asked permission again, either. She just stopped using my car because I started hiding my keys in my bedroom. 2 weeks after the car incident, I came home early from work on a Friday because I had a headache that wouldn't quit. I pulled into my driveway at 4:30 instead of my usual 6 and immediately knew something was wrong. There were cars parked all along my street, cars I didn't recognize, and I could hear music thumping from inside my house. Loud music, party music. I walked through my front door into absolute chaos. My living room was packed with people I'd never seen before, at least 20 strangers drinking and laughing and dancing. My kitchen was covered in liquor bottles and beer cans. Someone was smoking on my patio, the smoke drifting in through the open door. The coffee table I'd spent 2 months shopping for had wet rings all over it from drinks placed directly on the wood. There was some kind of red sauce splattered on my wall. And in the center of all of it, wearing one of my dresses that she'd clearly taken without asking, was her. She was holding court like the hostess of some upscale party, laughing too loud, clearly already drunk, completely at home in my space. She saw me standing there and her face went from surprise to annoyance in about half a second. I walked over to the sound system and turned off the music. The sudden silence was jarring, everyone stopping mid-conversation to stare at me. I asked what was happening, keeping my voice level despite wanting to scream. She said she was having a few friends over and I was being rude by interrupting. A few friends. There were 20+ people in my house. I said everyone needed to leave now, that this was my home and I hadn't given permission for any of this. She laughed, actually laughed, and told her friends to ignore me. She called me a controlling bitch who couldn't stand to see other people having fun, said I was jealous because I had no life of my own. Her friends started gathering their things, looking uncomfortable, clearly realizing they'd been brought into someone else's drama. As they filtered out, I started assessing the damage. A picture frame I'd gotten from my grandmother was shattered on the floor. There was red wine ground into my carpet in at least 3 places. Someone had burned a hole in my couch cushion with a cigarette. My nice cheese board was covered in dried-on food that nobody had bothered to clean. The bathroom was a disaster. Toilet paper everywhere, makeup smeared on my hand towels. I felt sick looking at it all. My father came home while I was still standing there surveying the destruction. He took one look at the scene, at her pouting in the corner, at me shaking with rage, and I actually thought he was going to defend me for once. Instead, he asked if I could just let them finish the party. It was only 10:30 on a Friday night, he said. It wasn't that late. People were having fun. They'd clean everything up, he promised. Good as new. I looked at him standing there, choosing her again, siding with her again, and something inside me snapped. Not broke. Snapped. Like a rubber band pulled too tight. I said no. The party was over. Everyone was out. And if he had a problem with that, he could leave too. He looked shocked, like he couldn't believe I was standing up to him. She jumped in immediately, getting in my face, screaming about what a miserable person I was, how I was just bitter because I was alone and nobody wanted me. She said I should be grateful they even lived there because otherwise I'd be just another sad single woman rattling around in an empty house. My father put his arm around her, comforting her like she was the victim in this situation. That's when I realized they were never leaving voluntarily. They'd found their perfect setup. Free housing, no responsibilities, someone to use and abuse who kept forgiving them. If I wanted my life back, I was going to have to take it back forcibly. But I wasn't quite ready yet. I still had this naive hope that my father would wake up, see what she really was, choose me for once. So I cleaned up the mess myself, spent 3 hours scrubbing and organizing, threw away my ruined belongings, and told myself I could endure a little longer. 10 months. That's how long she'd been living in my house, rent-free, destroying my peace of mind inch by inch when my father made his big announcement. It was a Tuesday morning in early August, and I was running late for work, rushing around trying to find my laptop charger that had mysteriously disappeared. My father was sitting at the kitchen table with this huge smile on his face, practically vibrating with excitement. He told me to sit down, that he had something important to share. I said I didn't have time. I was already late for a meeting. He said this would just take a minute. I sat, checking my watch, already annoyed. That's when he told me they were getting engaged. He'd proposed the night before with a ring he'd somehow managed to buy, and she'd said yes. He showed me the ring like I was supposed to ooh and ah over it, talking about how excited he was to start this new chapter, how he'd never been happier. I felt nauseous. This woman who'd been living off my generosity for almost a year, who'd never held a job the entire time I'd known her, who'd shown zero interest in actually building a life with him beyond living rent-free in my house, was now going to be my stepmother. I asked him if he was sure about this, trying to keep my voice neutral. I pointed out that they'd only known each other for 10 months, that maybe they should wait a bit longer, make sure this was really what he wanted. He said when you know, all that cliche bullshit people say when they're making terrible decisions. I asked if they'd discussed where they were going to live after getting married, hoping against hope that he'd say they were looking for their own place. He got this look on his face, like the question surprised him, and said they'd figure it out eventually, but for now we were all fine where we were. All fine. Watching my father light up over this nightmare of an engagement, I felt something die inside me. The last little bit of hope that he'd wake up, that he'd choose me, that he'd recognize what she was doing. It was over. I was on my own. Before I could respond to any of this, she walked into the kitchen wearing one of my robes, her hair wrapped in one of my good towels, and announced that they'd need $5,000 for the wedding. Not asked. Announced. Like I was an ATM machine that existed solely to fund their bad decisions. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. The audacity was almost impressive in its shamelessness. I said there was no way I was paying for their wedding. She got this look on her face, lips pursed like she'd tasted something sour, and said that $5,000 was nothing to someone like me. Someone like me. Single, no kids, good job, no one to spend money on. She said the least I could do was help my father have one happy day after everything he'd been through with his divorce and his struggles. She said I was selfish and bitter, that I couldn't stand to see them happy because I was so miserable in my own life. My father didn't defend me, didn't tell her to stop, didn't say a single word in my defense. Instead, he looked at me with these pleading puppy dog eyes and said it would mean the world to him. Then he started in on the manipulation. He talked about how my mother had abandoned him when I was young, how he'd raised me by himself, how hard that had been. He said he'd sacrificed his happiness for years to be a good father, and now he'd finally found someone who made him feel alive again. He said after everything he'd done for me, couldn't I do this one thing for him? And then he cried. Real tears streaming down his face as he talked about his loneliness and pain and desperate need for this wedding to happen. I sat there watching him perform because that's what it was, a performance, and I felt myself breaking. Not because I believed him, but because I was so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of being the villain, tired of defending my boundaries only to be told I was selfish. So I said yes. I said I'd pay for their fucking wedding. His face lit up like Christmas morning. Her face twisted into this smirk of victory that she didn't bother hiding. I transferred $5,000 that afternoon and immediately wanted to take it back, but I couldn't without proving every terrible thing she'd said about me. The next month was psychological torture. They planned their wedding with my money like they were spending someone else's Monopoly cash, choosing the most expensive options for everything without any consideration for budget or practicality. The venue they picked was some restored barn that charged premium prices for rustic charm. The catering was upscale farm-to-table stuff that cost twice what a normal buffet would. The flowers were imported. The photographer was award-winning. The cake was from some fancy bakery downtown. And then came the additional requests. My father would approach me every few days with a new financial need. The florist needed a deposit of $300 more than expected. Could I help? The photographer required an additional $200 for travel costs. Could I cover it? She wanted a specific champagne that wasn't included in the bar package, another $150. The invitations were more expensive than they'd budgeted. Could I chip in another $200? Every single time I said no, that I'd given them $5,000 and that's all they were getting. My father would get this wounded look. He'd talk about how this was his special day, how it only happens once. How could I be so stingy when I had plenty of money? She'd make snide comments about how some people were too selfish to help family celebrate, how she'd give her last dollar to help someone she loved, how lucky her friends were that they had generous people in their lives unlike me. The guilt trips were constant and exhausting. I started avoiding my own home entirely. I'd stay late at the office even when I'd finished all my work, just sitting at my desk reading articles or organizing files. I'd go to the gym after work and spend 2 hours there, taking extra long showers in the locker room. I'd drive around aimlessly, listening to podcasts, doing anything to delay going home. When I did have to be there, I'd hide in my small bedroom, the room that used to be for guests but was now my prison. I could hear them through the walls, laughing and planning their perfect day, paid for by the daughter they both treated like a walking wallet. About 2 weeks before the wedding, I came home early one evening because I'd forgotten an important file. I walked in quietly, not announcing myself, and I heard her on the phone in the living room. She was talking to one of her friends, her voice loud and careless, clearly not realizing I was there. She was laughing about how she'd finally found her meal ticket, how my father was stupid enough to actually believe she loved him, how the sex was boring but worth it for the free rent and spending money. She said once they were married, she'd convince him to kick me out so they could have the whole house to themselves. Her friend must have asked about the wedding because she started talking about that too. She said she'd specifically told my father she didn't want me there. She said I was a pathetic loser who'd probably show up in some tragic dress and ruin all her photos with my bitter face. She said the only good thing about me was my bank account, and once that was drained, she'd make sure I was gone for good. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to her tear apart my life while sitting on my couch in my home that I paid for. My father was in the next room, supposedly reading but definitely within earshot. He had to have heard at least some of this. When I walked into the living room, she barely reacted. Just gave me this look like I was interrupting her important phone call. I asked my father if he'd heard what she was saying. He claimed he had his headphones in, hadn't heard a thing. I repeated what she'd said, word for word, watching his face for some sign of shock or anger or defense. Nothing. He suggested I might have misheard, that I was stressed from work, that maybe I should talk to someone about my anxiety because I seemed to be getting paranoid. She chimed in, saying I was always trying to cause problems between them, that I was jealous and couldn't stand their happiness. My father nodded along like she was making perfect sense. That's when I realized he knew exactly who she was. He heard her, he understood what she was doing, and he simply didn't care. He'd chosen her, fully and completely, and I was just the ATM they were using until they could dispose of me. I walked to my room, locked the door, and started making plans. I was done being the victim in this story. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in early September. I'd bought a dress weeks earlier, a simple navy blue knee-length thing that was appropriate and actually pretty flattering. I'd even gotten my hair done that morning, blown out and styled, wanting to look nice despite everything. I bought them a gift, some expensive kitchen gadget they'd registered for, wrapped it carefully with a card that said, "Congratulations." I told myself I was going to this wedding to prove I was the bigger person, to show I could support my father even if I hated his choice. I showed up at the venue at 3:30 for a 4 o'clock ceremony, pulling into the parking lot of this renovated barn that my $5,000 had rented. The place was already buzzing with guests arriving, everyone dressed in their formal clothes, chatting and laughing. I walked into the main building carrying my gift, and a woman in a black suit with a tablet approached me immediately. She introduced herself as the event coordinator and asked for my name to check me in. I gave it, spelling it carefully, and watched her scroll through whatever list she had on her screen. Her expression changed from professional pleasantness to confusion to something like embarrassment. She asked me to wait just one moment and disappeared through a side door, leaving me standing in the entryway while other guests streamed past. I stood there for 5 minutes, then 10, feeling more awkward by the second. People were starting to look at me curiously, probably wondering why I was just standing there alone. Finally, the coordinator came back, and I could tell from her face that something was wrong. She asked if we could step outside for a moment, more privacy. We went out to a small patio area, and she told me, very quietly and apologetically, that my name wasn't on the guest list. I said that was impossible, that I was the father of the bride, no wait, the daughter of the groom, that there must be some mistake. She checked her tablet again, then turned it to show me. My name had been on the original list that was sent to her a month ago. But this morning, she'd received an updated list via email, and my name had been crossed out with a note in all caps. "Do not admit, per bride's explicit request." I felt my face burn with humiliation, standing there in my nice dress and styled hair, holding a gift for people who didn't want me at their wedding, the wedding I'd paid for. The coordinator looked genuinely sympathetic and said she'd go find the groom, that maybe there'd been some misunderstanding. She disappeared again, leaving me alone on this patio, and I seriously considered just leaving, driving away and never speaking to any of them again. But I needed to hear my father say it. I needed to look him in the eye and have him confirm this. 10 minutes later, the coordinator returned with my father following behind her, looking uncomfortable in his tuxedo. The tuxedo I'd probably paid for since I'd paid for everything else. We stood there on this patio with the ceremony about to start, and I asked him directly what was going on. He couldn't look at me, just stared at his fancy shoes and mumbled something about how his fiancée wanted the day to be positive energy only. I said I didn't understand, and he finally met my eyes. He said I'd been very negative about their relationship from the beginning. He said I'd never been happy for him, never supportive, always critical and judgmental. He said his bride felt strongly that she didn't want anyone present who couldn't celebrate their love wholeheartedly, and they'd decided together that it was better if I didn't attend. I asked him if he understood that I'd paid for this entire wedding. He said that was my choice, that nobody forced me, that I'd offered the money freely. I asked him if he realized how humiliating this was, being turned away from an event I'd funded. He said I was making it about me again when this was supposed to be their special day. Other guests had noticed us now, were definitely staring, recognizing family drama when they saw it. Before I could respond, she appeared. She walked over in her white dress that probably cost half my contribution, train dragging behind her, makeup perfect, looking like some fairy tale bride. She placed her hand on my father's arm possessively and looked at me with pure contempt. She said if I didn't leave voluntarily, she'd have security escort me out. She suggested I get some therapy for my issues with jealousy and bitterness before trying to contact them again. My father stood there and said nothing, didn't defend me, didn't tell her to stop, just nodded slightly like he agreed with her assessment. 2 security guards appeared, young guys who looked super uncomfortable with this situation, and they politely but firmly walked me back to my car. I passed several of my father's friends and relatives on the way, people I'd known my whole life, and they all looked away. Nobody said anything. Nobody intervened. I got in my car, carefully placed the gift I'd bought on the passenger seat, and opened my phone. There was a text message from her, sent about 10 minutes before I'd arrived. "Thanks for the 5K, you stupid bitch. Enjoy your empty house and empty life." I sat there reading it over and over, and something interesting happened. The humiliation and hurt transformed into something cold and crystalline and perfectly clear. I was done being their victim. I was done being generous and understanding and forgiving. They wanted me out of their lives? Fine. I'd make it permanent. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel, my mind working through logistics and timing. The ceremony would last about 30 minutes, then cocktail hour, then dinner and dancing. They wouldn't be home until at least midnight, probably closer to 1 or 2 in the morning, given how much drinking would happen at their reception. I had time, plenty of time. I pulled into my driveway at 4:45, walked into my house, and immediately started packing. Every single item that belonged to either of them went into boxes. I was systematic about it, methodical, working through the house room by room like I was conducting a professional inventory. Master bedroom first. All his clothes, all her clothes. Every single piece of clothing went into garbage bags and boxes. Shoes lined up and packed away. Toiletries from the bathroom. Every bottle and tube and container. Their towels, their sheets, their pillows. The cologne he'd bought with money he'd borrowed from me last month. The expensive lingerie she'd purchased on shopping trips while I was at work. Books from the nightstand. Chargers from the outlets, everything. Guest room that my father had been using for storage. Boxes of his old possessions. Photo albums. A lamp I'd let him keep even though it was ugly. Kitchen. Her ridiculous collection of herbal teas that she never drank. His special hot sauce. The beer in the fridge that I didn't drink. Living room. Her magazines. Her throw blanket. His reading glasses. Both of their phones' chargers. I found things I didn't even know were there. Wedding planning documents showing they'd spent $7,000 total, meaning they'd found other people to hit up for money. An envelope with $2,000 in cash hidden in his sock drawer, probably savings I didn't know about. A receipt for the ring showing he'd bought it on credit and hadn't made any payments yet. Evidence of their whole parasitic existence packed away methodically. I filled 15 boxes. 8 suitcases pulled from various closets throughout the house. 6 garbage bags. A dozen shopping bags. Every trace of them erased from my space. Then I dragged it all to the front lawn. Trip after trip carrying boxes and bags and suitcases, stacking them on my grass under the porch light like an installation art piece titled "Get the Fuck Out." My neighbors definitely saw me. The woman across the street came out at one point and asked if everything was okay. I told her everything was perfect. Best I'd felt in months. She looked at the mountain of belongings on my lawn and slowly backed away. Next step. Locks. I found a 24-hour locksmith service online and called them. The guy on the phone said they could come out, but it would be an emergency service fee, double the normal rate. I told him I didn't care about the cost. I needed someone there as soon as possible. He showed up 45 minutes later, this older guy with a tool belt and a knowing look on his face like he'd seen this type of situation before. He changed every lock in the house. Front door, back door, side door to the garage, even the window locks. He gave me 5 sets of new keys and took the old locks with him when he left. The whole thing took about 90 minutes and cost me $600, worth every penny. By 11:45, I had a house full of new locks and a lawn full of their belongings. I made myself tea, sat in my reclaimed living room, and waited. They arrived around 12:30, and I heard them before I saw them. Her high-pitched, drunk laugh, his loud off-key singing, car doors slamming, the stumbling walk up the driveway. Then silence. I imagined them standing there, staring at the mountain of their possessions scattered across my lawn, trying to process what they were seeing, then yelling, my father's voice shouting my name, angry and panicked, her screeching something I couldn't make out. I heard him trying his key in the lock, trying it again and again like it would suddenly work through force of will. More yelling, pounding on the door, her kicking something, probably one of the boxes. I sat in the dark living room sipping my tea, feeling calmer than I had in months. After about 10 minutes of this, I stood up, turned on the porch light, and walked to the front door. I opened it with the chain lock engaged, just enough to see them, but not enough for them to force their way in. My father's face was red and sweaty, his bow tie hanging loose, his tuxedo jacket rumpled and stained. His new wife stood behind him in her wedding dress, makeup smeared down her face, holding her shoes in one hand and using the other to steady herself against the doorframe. They were both clearly drunk, swaying slightly, and they started talking at once. Him demanding to know what I thought I was doing. Her threatening to call the police. Him saying I couldn't just lock them out. Her screaming about how this was illegal. I waited until they both ran out of breath. Then I spoke very quietly so they'd have to stop shouting to hear me. I said they'd made their position very clear this afternoon. They didn't want me in their lives. They didn't value my presence. They didn't respect my contribution to their special day. So I was simply returning the favor. They were no longer welcome in my home. I'd packed their belongings carefully. Nothing was damaged. Everything they owned was right there on the lawn. And I suggested they figure out their living arrangements quickly because I was going to bed. My father's expression changed from anger to genuine panic. He asked where they were supposed to go. I said that wasn't my problem anymore. He started crying, those same manipulative tears he'd used on me so many times before, saying I couldn't do this, that he was my father, that family doesn't abandon family. I looked him directly in the eyes and told him he'd abandoned me first, at my most humiliated, in front of everyone I knew, after I'd given him everything. His new wife pushed forward, trying to force the door open, screaming that this was illegal, that they had tenant rights, that she'd sue me for everything I had. I told her very calmly that my father had never paid rent, had never signed a lease, and was legally considered a guest in my home. Guests can be asked to leave at any time. I'd confirmed this with my lawyer friend that afternoon while they were at their reception. She threatened to break down the door. I reminded her there were security cameras recording everything, and breaking and entering was a crime. She called me every name you can think of, really creative stuff, while my father just stood there crying. I told them both to have a nice life and closed the door. Locked it. Chain, deadbolt, the works. Then I walked back to my couch and listened to them rage outside for another 30 minutes. Eventually, the yelling stopped. I peeked through the window and watched them load their belongings into their car, the same car they'd driven to their wedding reception. It was a sedan, way too small for all their stuff. They made 3 trips, shoving boxes and suitcases into the trunk and back seat, arguing with each other about what would fit and what wouldn't. A lot of it ended up staying on the curb because there simply wasn't room. Her wedding dress was getting dirty, dragging through my grass and catching on boxes. His tuxedo was a wrinkled mess. They looked absolutely miserable, and I felt nothing but satisfaction. Around 1:30 in the morning, they drove away, car packed to bursting, leaving some of their belongings scattered on my lawn. I waited until I couldn't hear their car anymore, then went outside and dragged the remaining items to the curb for trash pickup. Then I went to bed in my master bedroom, the bedroom I should have been sleeping in all along, and I slept better than I had in a year. The next few days were chaos, but manageable chaos that I controlled. My phone exploded with messages and calls. My father tried every number he had for me, left voicemails that ranged from apologetic to rageful to manipulative, saying he was sorry, saying I was heartless, saying we could work this out if I just answered the phone, saying I'd regret this. His new wife sent text after text, first begging me to let them back in, then threatening legal action, then insulting me, then begging again. I blocked both of their numbers after reading the first few. Delete, block, done. Then the extended family started calling. My uncle, my father's older brother, called me on Monday morning absolutely furious. He demanded to know what I'd done, how I could treat my father this way, throwing him out in the street after his wedding. I let him rant for about 2 minutes. Then I calmly told him the whole story from the beginning, how I'd taken my father in when he had nowhere else to go, how I'd given him my bedroom, my space, my peace, how his girlfriend had moved in without permission and proceeded to disrespect me and my home for 10 months straight, how they demanded $5,000 for a wedding, then banned me from attending that same wedding after I'd paid for it, how I'd been humiliated publicly and decided I was done being their victim. My uncle went very quiet on the other end of the line. Then he sighed, long and heavy, and said he didn't know about most of that. He said they were staying in a motel off the highway, some cheap place that charged by the week. My father was embarrassed and didn't know what to do next. I said he should have thought about consequences before burning bridges with the person keeping a roof over his head. My uncle said I was right, that my father had made his bed, but asked if I could maybe find it in myself to forgive him eventually. He said family was important, that holding grudges only hurt yourself in the end. I said maybe someday I'd forgive him, but that day wasn't today or anytime soon. I needed time and space to heal from what they'd done to me. He said he understood, that he'd keep my father away from me for a while. We ended the call on decent terms. At least someone in the family saw reason. The weeks that followed were transformative in ways I didn't expect. I reclaimed my house completely, room by room, making it mine again. I deep cleaned everything, scrubbing away traces of their presence. I bought new sheets and towels in colors I actually liked. I redecorated the master bedroom, finally hanging artwork I'd been storing in the garage. I turned the smaller guest room into a proper home office, setting up my desk by the window with a view of the garden. I threw out the couch with the cigarette burn and bought a new one, a comfortable sectional I'd wanted for years. I repainted my kitchen a warm yellow color that made me happy every time I walked in. I replaced all the dishes they'd chipped and broken. I restocked my wine collection, this time keeping it in my bedroom where nobody could touch it. Each change felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost. I started going out again, accepting invitations to dinners and parties I'd been declining for months because I didn't want to leave them alone in my house. I reconnected with friends who'd noticed I'd withdrawn and were happy to have me back. I went on a few dates with guys from dating apps, nothing serious, but it felt good to remember I was a person with a life beyond being my father's caretaker and wallet. Work improved dramatically because I wasn't constantly stressed and distracted. I got promoted to senior engineer after successfully completing a major project. My boss said I seemed more focused and energized than I had in months. I told him I'd made some changes in my personal life that freed up a lot of mental space. He said whatever I was doing, I should keep doing it. About 8 weeks after the wedding, my uncle called again. He said he thought I should know that my father's marriage had fallen apart. I wish I could say I was surprised, but I absolutely wasn't. According to my uncle, the new wife had become unbearable once she realized the gravy train had permanently left the station. Without my house to live in and my money to spend, the fantasy of an easy, comfortable life had evaporated. She'd started drinking heavily. Not just social drinking, but serious problem drinking. They'd gotten into screaming matches in their motel room loud enough that other guests complained. She'd accused my father of being worthless and pathetic, blamed him for losing their perfect setup, told him he'd ruined her life by being too weak to control his bitch daughter. During one particularly bad fight, she'd actually hit him, slapped him hard enough to leave a mark. The motel manager had called the police after another guest reported domestic violence. The cops had shown up, separated them, taken statements. My father had filed for divorce the next day. The marriage lasted exactly 6 weeks. She'd left town immediately, taking whatever cash she could grab from their shared account, which apparently wasn't much because they'd already spent most of it on extending their motel stay. My uncle said my father was completely defeated now. He'd found a job at a bakery, starting work at 5 in the morning to prepare bread and pastries, making minimum wage after years of white-collar work. He'd rented a room in a house owned by one of his co-workers, a tiny space barely big enough for a bed and a dresser. He'd sold most of his possessions because he had nowhere to store them. According to my uncle, my father was deeply ashamed and finally understood what I'd been trying to tell him all along. He wanted to apologize but didn't think I'd accept his calls. My uncle was right about that last part. I asked if my father had specifically sent him to deliver this message. My uncle admitted yes, that my father had asked him to feel me out about the possibility of reconciliation. I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. I said I appreciated the update, but I wasn't ready to talk to my father. Maybe someday, but not now, not soon. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. I needed more time and maybe therapy before I could even consider forgiving him. My uncle said he understood and would pass the message along. He told me to take care of myself, that I'd done what I needed to do. That actually helped, hearing someone from my father's side validate my choices. 3 months after that disaster wedding, I was genuinely, truly happy. Not just okay, not just surviving, but thriving in ways I hadn't in years. I'd started taking a pottery class on Thursday evenings at a local art studio, something I'd always been curious about but never made time for. Turns out I'm actually pretty good at it. And there's something meditative about working with clay, shaping something with your hands, creating something from nothing. I'd planned a vacation to visit my friend who'd moved across the country, 2 weeks off work that I actually felt excited about instead of guilty for taking. I'd adopted a cat from the shelter, a massive orange tabby I named Biscuit, who spent most of his time sleeping in sunbeams and demanding treats. Having something alive in the house that actually appreciated me felt revolutionary. My home felt like mine again in every possible way. I'd wake up in the morning and feel peace instead of dread. No more walking on eggshells. No more cleaning up after ungrateful guests. No more wondering what fresh hell would greet me when I walked through my front door at the end of the day. No more being treated like a servant or an ATM in my own house. Just me, my space, my rules, my peace. Did I think about my father sometimes? Yes. Did I wonder how he was doing? Occasionally. Did I feel guilty? Sometimes late at night I'd feel a pang of something like regret. But then I'd remember standing in that wedding venue lobby, being told I wasn't welcome at an event I'd paid for, being humiliated in front of people I'd known my whole life, and the guilt would fade away like smoke. He'd made his choices. Multiple choices, over and over, consistently choosing her over me, choosing comfort over integrity, choosing manipulation over honesty. He'd watched her disrespect me for months and said nothing. He'd demanded my money while giving me nothing but grief in return. He'd allowed me to be publicly humiliated and stood by silently while it happened. Those were his decisions, his choices, his actions, and he was living with the consequences just like I was living with mine. The difference was, my consequences had led to freedom, self-discovery, and genuine happiness. His had led to a failed marriage, a minimum wage job, and a rented room. I didn't take pleasure in his suffering. I'm not that petty. But I also didn't regret my actions. I'd protected myself finally, after months of being too generous, too forgiving, too understanding for my own good. And that felt like exactly the right thing to have done. Some people might think I was too harsh. That family deserves second chances. That I should have been more patient, more forgiving, more accommodating. Maybe they're right. Maybe in some alternate universe there was a better way to handle all of this. But those people didn't live through what I lived through. They didn't spend 10 months watching their home get invaded, their belongings stolen, their boundaries trampled. They didn't hear the woman their father planned to marry call them a pathetic loser behind their back. They didn't stand in that lobby wearing a dress they'd carefully chosen, holding a gift they'd thoughtfully selected, only to be told they weren't welcome at a wedding they'd funded. They didn't experience the specific humiliation of being escorted out by security while relatives watched in silence. So those people can have their opinions, and I can have mine. I've made my peace with what happened. My father knows where I am if he ever becomes someone worth reconciling with. Someone who's done actual work on himself. Someone who understands what he did wrong and takes real responsibility for it. Until that happens, if it ever happens, I'm living my life on my own terms. I'm enjoying my space. I'm building friendships and pursuing hobbies and focusing on career goals. I'm learning that sometimes the most generous thing you can do for yourself is set boundaries and stick to them, even when it hurts. Even when people call you selfish. Even when it means severing relationships you thought were permanent. I'm learning that protecting your peace isn't cruel, it's necessary. And I'm learning that sometimes family doesn't mean unconditional forgiveness for unforgivable behavior. Sometimes it just means knowing when to walk away.